Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. I'd just like to take a couple of minutes just to sort of set the scene, who we are, who yes, Berwickshire are, and what we're hoping to get out of the evening in terms of how we'd like to run it. But just a couple of domestics, if I may, which is always very important. The ladies and gents toilets are just at the back of the room there, through the swing doors. If there is a fire, we'll just get out as quickly as we can, but we're not expecting anything tonight, so they're the sort of key domestics, if I may. How we'd like to play the evening, if we can, is we'll hear from our guest speakers who I'll introduce in a couple of minutes to you. Approximately 10, maybe 12 minutes each. Then we will have a break, and we'd like to invite you to have a cup of tea or coffee with us and some homemade shortbread. And then following the short interval, we'd like to really open it up to yourselves, because this is what it's all about. It's not about us standing up here and speaking to you. We'd like to talk to yourselves as individuals and hear what your concerns are, what your worries are, what your aspirations might be for this big decision that we're all facing in September. I'd like to encourage you, if you can, we have a number of my colleagues walking around. We have these little pro formers, sort of questionnaire forms. Very conscious that some people don't feel comfortable asking questions in a sort of public domain. So please, if I can encourage you, if you'd like to fill one in and then hand it to one of my colleagues between now and the interval, and we'd be more than happy to raise it after the interval. And so this will really be our catalyst in terms of our conversation. And we'd very much like to invite it and open it up to the floor as well, and just get a nice little debate going if we can. There's plenty of information over there if anyone would like some information, some literature, very much from a yes perspective. I think it's important just to mention as well, before we go any further, I'm part of a Yes Berwickshire group, and I'm very honoured to say that I chair the group. We've been running for about a year now. We're all local people. None of us are politicians. None of us have really been involved in any of this before in our lives. But there are some things that come along in life that are just too important not to get up, not to get involved in. And this is why we do these things. This is our 10th, I believe, 10th independence debate. We started off in Gordon back in January, and we're finishing Coldstream tonight. We have one more to go if anyone's interested. We're having a further meeting in Eyemouth on the 15th of August, and I'm pleased to say we have Jim Sillers coming down to Eyemouth High School, again, to talk to people about why he's looking for a yes vote in September. I think the final thing, other than please encourage you to fill this in if you can, is that we are videoing this tonight. We're videoing it as it comes. There's no editing, there's nothing hidden, and our plan is to post it on YouTube maybe in a day or two. Now, we'd like to encourage, we'd be very happy to video yourselves as well if anyone would like to ask a question. The camera will be pointing this way most of the night. If anyone objects to being videoed, please let us know and we won't do it in terms of videoing yourselves. But if you don't have any objection, we'll be happy just to run with it and let it go as it goes. So about 40 minutes from ourselves up here, a little 10 to 15 minute interval, and then very much over to yourselves on the floor. So what I'd like to do now for me is I'll just introduce our panel tonight, and I'm very, very pleased and honoured to have three great guests with us this evening. On my far right, if I can introduce first of all, Professor Nigel Mace. Nigel is a graduate of the Glasgow and Edinburgh Universities in Law and History, and is now a retired academic historian. He's a former head of history at University College in Plymouth, and Vernon Professor of Biography at the US Ivy League, Dartmouth College, New Hampshire, where he taught for almost 25 years. His specialist fields are 20th century British European history, film and propaganda. In addition, Renaissance and late medieval Europe. Some of you may be aware of the following publications. He's the translator and is the only author into English language of the Scots play A Satire of Three Estates. I'm sure some of you may be aware of that. And he's currently working on the English edition of Blind Harry's epic poem, William Wallace. So I'm very pleased to welcome Nigel along tonight. Our second guest this evening, and again very pleased to introduce Ash Regan Denham. Ash is representing tonight Women for Independence. Ash is a parliamentary lobbyist for the think tank, the Julia Reid Foundation. I'm sure some of you may have heard of that. And is a valued colleague and friend of our own group within the wider Yes Borders community. Her master's degree is in international development, and she has a strong interest in how countries can develop their resources to the benefit of all its citizens. I'd like to welcome Ash again tonight. And finally, second guest appearance from Colin, because we were so chuffed and impressed with him the first time round in Eyemouth about a month ago. He's kindly come back again. Introduce Colin Fox. Colin is the national spokesman of the Scottish Socialist Party and is now Scotland's longest serving party leader. Tonight is something actually of a spiritual homecoming for Colin, because he admits to having a soft spot for Berwickshire, as he often came to Eyemouth, Coldstream, St Abbs, and would you believe Duns and Churnside for holidays as a boy. So it's a bit of a spiritual local. It's a local basically, aye. Born in Motherwell, he now lives in Edinburgh, where he served as a Lothian MSP for the Scottish Socialist Party between 2003 and 2007. He sits on the Yes Scotland Advisory Board and is in great demand at public meetings on independence across Scotland, and I can vouch for that. If any of you heard Colin before, it's a real honour to have him this evening. This week alone, certainly this is historically, I know for a fact Colin's been to Inverness, Hamilton, Stirling, and a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago when we met him, he was finishing a late meeting in Eyemouth with us about 11 o'clock at night, jumped in the car, and I think shot up to Inverness, I think the next day for...
Coldstream's my favourite.
He was up in Inverness for Brian's big debate, and I can safely say he made it there because we heard him on the radio the next day. And as I say, it's an honour to have Colin back tonight as well. So it's our three guest speakers for the evening. So really that's enough for me. It's not about myself tonight, it's really about why we're voting yes. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this evening, if I may, Professor Nigel Mace. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And can I say that I've spent most of my life in front of audiences of students talking about matters of history which are to me of supreme importance. But no address I've ever given to anybody matters more than speaking to an audience of my fellow Scots about the decision that we have to make in September. I'd like to start by thinking a little bit about the kind of consequences and outcomes that are not on offer in September. And I'll start with a personal story. I want to go back to 1967, not because of the Hamilton by-election, nothing to do with politics. It happened to be the first time that I went to the United States of America. And I went as a resource person to a conference on reform and change in higher education. And I went with considerable pride in the system that existed in the United Kingdom. A national system, publicly funded and yet independent, of higher education that was freely available to everybody who had the capacity to benefit from it, and indeed even was provided with grants. I also went very proud of one other aspect of the United Kingdom, our welfare state, and particularly its National Health Service. And though the generosity of my hosts took me to many different universities in Illinois, Chicago, Harvard, MIT, and New York, I came back, impressed though I was with those institutions, with my pride in the United Kingdom and its system of higher education and public funding for health, even more deeply entrenched. Those values I have not lost. I'm afraid the United Kingdom has lost them. I am not leaving it, it has been leaving me. The other matter that I want to, so a no vote in September will not bring those values back. Secondly, a no vote in September is not going to provide us with any expansion of the powers of the Holyrood Parliament. Let's be quite clear about it. The parties who currently, in the last few months, have been making noises about various possible guarded pledges and promises of changes in favour of Holyrood are precisely the parties whose managed disagreements made sure that there was no devo anything on the ballot paper in September. For if there had been, and that option had won, as it looked very likely to do according to the polls, those very parties would have been obliged to enact the legislation which they had not done when they had been in power and had every opportunity so to do. So let us be clear, a no vote is not going to bring any enhancement of the powers of Holyrood. What does matter, I think, supremely is a yes vote in September. And I want to give you 4 reasons for my voting yes, and I hope for you as well. The first of those is what I will call the real democratic deficit. Now, I don't mean by this just the fact, and it is a fact, that very often Scotland votes for a party of government which then is not installed in Westminster. We have just now one Conservative MP in Scotland, and yet we have a Conservative-dominated government in Westminster. But there was a time when such a conclusion could be argued to have been reasonable. Speaking as a historian, in the late 40s and the 50s, and indeed well into the 60s, we were still in the period of what historians regard as the post-war consensus. That sort of common ground which, to differing degrees with different parties, was the agreed territory of the British state and British politics won by the Second World War. A mixed economy with a very substantial public sector that owned utilities and provided services, and a healthy private sector as well. And running through the whole thing and underpinning it, a welfare state in which the principle of universal benefits was widely accepted and nowhere more clearly exemplified than in the National Health Service. But that uniform polity across the United Kingdom has gone. We no longer have a situation in which it's reasonable to regard a vote in Scotland as the same as a vote in Yorkshire or a vote in the southwest of England, where I spent most of my professional career. We now have 2 very different polities, and they're not merely different, but they're diverging in completely opposite directions. And let me take the National Health Service as an example. From the beginning, there was an English National Health Service and a Scottish National Health Service. They've always been separate. However, they had the same uniting philosophy. But what do we have now? We have a situation in England in which there is no National Health Service in the original sense of the term. The obligation on the Secretary of State to provide for a uniform service across the country has been removed from the statute book. And instead, the new legislation for the English Health Service has enshrined in it the principle of commercial competition. What has happened in Scotland? Since 1999, we've had the remarkable chance to look at what an independent Scotland might look like. We've watched Holyrood over those 15 years having a Labour administration, a Labour and Lib Dem administration, a minority Scottish National administration, and now a majority Scottish National government. And throughout those 15 years, despite their differences, Holyrood has trended in one particular direction. It has been broadly social democratic, it has been broadly progressive, and in the case of the National Health Service, they reversed the marketisation process that Tony Blair had introduced, and from then they have gone on to re-establish the Scottish National Health Service on the original principles on which the NHS was set up, an integrated national service with a responsibility to provide it across the nation as a whole. We no longer have a single polity in the United Kingdom. We have 2 very different ones. And it is a matter of health for a democracy that we cannot go on with Scotland massively outnumbered by English MPs who belong to a different polity with different objectives. The only way forward for us as a democratic community is to have our own government. And that means a yes vote in September and progress to independence. I want to come to my second reason for voting yes. and that is the management and control of our natural resources. For more than 40 years, we've watched Westminster governments squander the revenues from North Sea oil and gas on a variety of short-term objectives. In the entire world, there are only 2 oil-rich countries which do not have a sovereign oil fund. One is the pitiful state of Iraq. The other is Scotland. And that is a scandal that must come to an end. The money was wasted by Labour governments on correcting budgetary errors and by the Tory governments in the 1980s. Don't believe me, read Alan Clark's diaries where he says quite plainly they could not have afforded the cheap privatisation of national public utilities if it had not been for the revenues from the North Sea. So I want to see our revenues from oil and gas employed for the benefit of the society and the people of Scotland. And make no mistake about it, this is not about 40 or 50 years, which was last year's estimates of the longevity of the resources in the North Sea. It's much, much more than that. It's the Scottish Atlantic margin. The last major report on that simply said the largest oil field in the world is west of Lewis. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Lancaster well that was brought in just to the west of Shetland showed that that is no longer a technically impossible area. It will be the area of future development, and we're talking about decades of supplies there. And that brings us down further to the west coast and the Clyde Firth, areas which at the moment we cannot investigate and exploit because of Trident. So our resources in oil and gas is something that we need to have deployed for the reindustrialising and the redevelopment of Scotland, and not to fritter away on Westminster short-termism. That takes me to my third reason for voting yes. I want to see an end of pointless expenditure, extravagant expenditure that brings no good to Scotland. Let's take a non-military example for a start. What about the £4.7 billion at current estimates that Scotland will have to pay towards that high-speed train which may eventually reach Leeds in 2030? There are no plans for it coming anywhere near Scotland. But worse even than that is the over £1 billion a year that we will be paying for more than a decade, again at current estimates, for the replacement and redevelopment of the Trident nuclear missile programme. This is not only a ludicrous weapon, which has got nothing to do with the threats which we actually face from international terrorism. It is also an immoral weapon. It is also hideously expensive, and it happens to make my home city, because despite the noise I make, I'm actually Glaswegian born and bred. I just happen to have acting parents. I ask you for sympathy for a moment. I sounded like this, and my first name is Nigel, and I grew up in Glasgow and went to school in the Gorbals. No, the issue of the nuclear programme at Faslane and Coolport is something I feel particularly warmly about, for it has made my native city and approximately a quarter of the urban population of Scotland into the largest nuclear target in Western Europe. It is high time that was ended, and with it, its disastrous expenditure. And my fourth reason, I'm not a narrow nationalist. I have no time for narrow nationalism. I'm an internationalist. I believe powerfully in our place in the world, and particularly our place in the continent of Europe, the continent whose culture we have always belonged to. I want to see us in Europe. That is why I'm voting yes, because only by voting yes will we know that we will remain within the EU. If you want the details on this, I'm happy to give you more of them, but the Professor of EU Constitutional Law at Oxford University, Shona Douglas-Scott, who's an Edinburgh woman originally, published an article just 2 weeks ago making it perfectly clear that what will happen in the 18-month period after the referendum is a negotiation which will result in a process which is called internal enlargement under Article 48 of the treaty. She is the author of the standard work on EU constitutional law, which is currently just going into yet another edition. Put aside any thoughts that we are leaving the EU. Our only chance of leaving the EU is if there is a no vote and we face the danger of being dragged out of the European Union by the Eurosceptic and Europhobe votes that are steadily accumulating in England and which will have their effect in the referendum in 2017. So for all these reasons, I want us to vote yes. I want us to have, at last, a democratic government which deals with the affairs of Scotland, for the people of Scotland, and with the resources of Scotland. At the moment, Holyrood receives just 7.9% of the revenue which this country actually raises. After the implementation of the Scotland Act, that is going to rise to a staggering nearly 15%. It is high time that we controlled the full extent of our resources. And not only financial ones, not only oil and gas, but also making use of the huge potential which we have as a country, as people. Let's just remember that a few weeks ago, an international report was published on the different qualities of education around the world. Scotland is the most highly educated country in the whole of Europe, bar none. It is in fact the third most educated country in the entire world. We have the resources, we have the people. What we need is the will and the commitment and a yes vote in September. Thank you very much.
Just one quick point, if I may, before I pass you on to Ash. It's something I really should have said at the start of the night. It's an important point to make. I alluded to this as our 10th independence debate in Berwickshire. On every occasion, we have invited Better Together to come to our meetings, to give you, the people of Berwickshire, the opportunity to hear from both sides. They refuse to debate with us. I've contacted their headquarters, I've contacted local MSPs, I've actually spoke personally to the local MSP and they refuse to debate with yes. So unfortunately tonight, in an ideal world, you would hear both sides of the argument under the one roof in a reasonably civilised manner, allowing you to go away to make up your own informed opinions on the matter. But unfortunately, they will not debate with us. So I think that's just an important thing to put into context, if I may. And this is happening across Scotland. I hear stories of debates being organised, the Better Together side being invited to come along, and then at the last minute, they don't turn up. We've been involved in debates where we've tried to get debates in organisations and in schools and sheltered accommodations, and because we can't get Better Together to come in as well, we're not allowed to go in. It's just one of the things that we have to work with. It's not a cheap political point, it's a fact. So for anyone tonight that is wondering, it's a great meeting, really enjoyed it, but it'd be nice to hear the other side of the story. We try. For those who've saw the Berwickshire today, there's a piece in there. The Berwickshire are very good at actually putting some of our bits and pieces in, and there's again another plea in the Berwickshire today saying anyone would like to debate with us, we're more than happy to. So I just felt it's important just to sort of nail that down in case anyone's got a concern on it. So Nigel, thank you very much again, that was excellent. I'd like to introduce our second speaker for the evening now, if I may, Ash. Thank you.
Good evening. It's great to be here. There are many reasons why somebody might want to vote yes in September, and I'm just going to share with you a couple of mine. As is often the case, I heard the ambulance well before I saw it. I was 18, and I remember I was walking up to sixth form college, and it roared past me, sirens blaring, and all the lights were flashing. And I remember noticing it, and I remember thinking, as you do when you see an ambulance rushing, where's it going? What misery is on the other end of this? You know, is it an elderly person that's had a stroke, or is it going to a car crash or something like that? And I didn't know, and I carried on my journey. Later on, I was to find out that actually that ambulance was heading to my house, where my father, who had been recently, very recently, diagnosed with terminal cancer, had collapsed, and he actually died in that ambulance on the way to North Devon Hospital, aged just 49 years old. He was a heavy smoker, and it was a smoking-related cancer. But I think there was more to it than that. When he was a child, his parents had sent him to a private school in Glasgow, but he was severely dyslexic. And I think at that time, so we're talking sort of late 40s, early 1950s, I don't think it was really a thing you could have. So I think it was more of a case of, you know, you're a bit stupid or whatever. So I think his parents were a bit worried about everything that was going on. And when he inevitably failed his 11+, they yanked him out of the school, you know, assumed that he was stupid, and basically wrote him off for the rest of his life. And I think he spent the next 30 years or so trying to prove that wrong, trying to prove to himself that he wasn't actually stupid. So I guess that kind of feeds into this idea about life expectancy. And many of you may be aware Scotland isn't doing very well by that indicator internationally. We were doing okay until about the 1950s, and then our position relative to the other countries in Europe just started to decline. So much so that we're actually known now as the sick man of Europe. We've got one of the lowest life expectancies, despite obviously being a rich country, and despite having the same government as the country next door to us, England. We have much worse outcomes than they do. If you take two equally deprived areas, one say in Liverpool and then maybe one in Glasgow, the one in Glasgow, the life expectancies will always be shorter. Why? Well, nobody really knows. But it's called the Scottish effect, and there are theories being put forward. One of those has been put forward by the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, and they said that their theory is that since the 1950s, Scotland has been under what they call political attack. The idea that having wave after wave of policies visited onto you in quite a violent way, where you feel you don't have the control or a way to react against them. And I suppose a good example of that would be the poll tax, where obviously it was trialled in Scotland before anywhere else. And this leads Scots to feel frustrated about their situation and maybe turn that frustration in on themselves. And that's why we see these typical Scottish effect diseases such as smoking too much, drinking too much, drug abuse, depression, and so on. Leslie Riddoch has called these the diseases of desperation. And in fact, the Scottish effect follows you even if you leave Scotland, probably as it followed my father. And if you move to another area, let's say you move to England, statistically you'll live to the Scottish life expectancy average rather than the longer one of those around you. I think this failure to live up to your potential is caused by seeing yourself only as others see you and not having that control over your own environment. And I think that is what is the Scottish effect. Because after all, if you're told enough times that you're too wee and you're too poor and you're too stupid, eventually you're going to start to believe it. We're living with the consequences of this now. That message is seeping in and has seeped into the Scottish psyche, I think. It steals our confidence, creates hopelessness, and in some people it causes despair, and so we die too soon. Scotland has been dying of a broken heart. I would add, and as addition to that, that I think that since devolution and having a Scottish Parliament, for once we've had somebody to stand up and fight for Scotland, and I think we can all see that that's had a positive effect. The No campaign often uses this as a reason for voting no. They say having a Scottish Parliament with limited powers, but still being part of the UK, they say that's the best of both worlds. But I think that's totally nonsensical. We've got no control over our own money or our resources. The UK actually decides how much of our money that they're going to give back to us. We can't speak for ourselves on the world stage, or indeed in Europe. And in the EU, having a voice would be useful, as there's extremely important issues there that really affect Scotland, like fishing and agriculture. We don't have any power over things like welfare, employment, or investment decisions. So we can't create any real change for the people of Scotland. We're only really able to tinker around the edges of this broken economic model. How is that the best of both worlds? The Scottish Parliament is a bit like a lone salmon trying to swim upstream against this tide of third worldisation policies that are spewing out of Westminster. If you ever get the opportunity and you're lucky enough to be able to travel to other countries, particularly in Northern Europe, this type of thing, it smacks you right in the face when you go there and you see the way that other countries are quite different from the way things are here. How can these countries manage it? Having high pay, shorter working hours, lower unemployment, higher pensions, much, much cheaper childcare, gleaming public transport, national industries, remember them? Smooth, uncongested roads and affordable housing. They can because they can make better and different decisions. We could do that too. You have to ask yourself a question. Look around Scotland and think, is this really as good as it gets? I know us yes people are having a bit of a reputation in the main for this, being unrelentingly positive. And I think in the main we are. I generally am myself. All the yes supporting political parties have got a vision for a different and a better Scotland. I mean, heck, a common meal can show you a complete blueprint from how to get from here to there. But the no side, they don't have anything like that. There's no vision coming from them. And I think that's because they just assume if they keep quiet, we'll all just think that we're voting, if we vote no, we're going to be voting, we're going to be getting the status quo. I'm here to tell you that I don't think a no vote is a vote for the status quo. I think what's going to happen to Scotland if we vote no is not going to be pretty, and I don't think we're going to like any of it. So I'd like people to be aware that if they're voting no, this is what you're voting for. You're voting for a cut in Scotland's funding. Some of the Tories have actually admitted to this, and you can find references to that. You're voting for privatisation of the Scottish NHS, as Nigel has alluded to already. It's already happening down south. You're voting for more and worse austerity, more food banks. You're voting for tuition fees, an end to free personal care for the elderly. More privatisation, Scottish Water, that's probably next on the list. More welfare sanctions, prescription charges, rising inequality, and more abuse of the tax system by large corporations. I mean, I could go on, I could probably be here all night, because this is what the UK is. It's a me-first economic model that benefits only the few at the top. And if you're thinking, like me, that this is not sounding too good and hoping maybe the Scottish Government will be able to protect us, not this time. We'll have given away all of our power. We'll have no say, pretty much as we do now. For example, let's say we do vote no, let's say there's a new political party, let's say every single person in Scotland votes for that new political party that stands against austerity at the next general election. It wouldn't help us, it wouldn't do anything. 55 seats at Westminster out of 650. We'd be voted down every single time. So before I depress you all too much, I'll just move on to my final story. About 7 years ago, my husband and I decided that we wanted to build our own eco-house. So we were trying to find a plot to buy, and it was the height of property madness. It was about, I think it was 2007, and we were getting outbid all over the place on various different plots. Finally, we found this plot, and I think the reason we were able to buy it and that nobody else had wanted it was a slope, and it was pretty much basically like that, so it's quite an extreme slope. And I think that all the other people that I'd looked at had just thought, do you know what, that's not worth the trouble, it's just going to be too difficult. So anyway, we bought it, quite excited and everything, and we'd had an architect lined up to come and have a look at it. brought him to the site, and he took one look at it, and he said, "You can't do it, you can't get a house on here." I was absolutely devastated. I thought, what have I done? This is a terrible, I didn't know. I didn't know what I was going to do next. But I thought, right, stay calm, persevere. So eventually, I did find an architect that could do a design that could fit on the plot. And I did go ahead and build it. I did have a lot of people telling me that I wouldn't be able to do it, and they used to take great delight in coming to the plot and saying to me, "Oh, you'll never be able to do this, this is too difficult, this is going to be a nightmare, oh, do you know what you're getting yourself in for?" I was like, I had quite a few problems while I was doing the build, I won't lie to you. No builders would take the job on for me, so I had to hire in all of the trades myself, and I had various problems with the design, and I had problems finding good plumbers and so on. I had massive problems with health and safety. I'm not quite sure what was going on there. Maybe he took a little bit of a shine to me because he just kept coming back. I couldn't get rid of him. I had to fire 4 different sets of plumbers, and we had this rainwater tank that I'd gone to a special show to buy and had delivered and everything. And in the end, never quite got around to fitting it. But you know what? We finished it. It's a fantastic house. But the best thing about it is that it's unique and it's personal to us. It's not somebody else's vision of what a family house should be. It's our vision of a family house, and it's designed around the way that we wanted to live in it. And if I decided all those years ago that it was going to be too difficult, then that house that I've come from tonight, which is in a little bit west of here in the Borders, where I've actually seen people on the main road stop their cars outside and jump out to take a quick picture of it, that house wouldn't exist, it wouldn't be there. And as Mandela said, everything seems impossible until it's done. And Scotland becoming independent, it seems like that to many people. It seems like it's too risky, it seems like it's too difficult, and the No campaign, as we know, are more than happy to play on those fears. But we shouldn't give up on Scotland before we've even started. Let's not content ourselves with somebody else's vision of how Scotland should be. Let's plan and build our own vision of Scotland, a better Scotland. It might not be easy, but it will be worth it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ash. We'll just move on now, right, and I'd like to introduce Colin Fox, the final speaker for the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much to ES Berwickshire for organising tonight's meeting, and above all, thank you all for coming. It's a great delight to be back here after the triumph we had in Eyemouth, and I look forward to your questions. I would just say at the beginning, I think, to put tonight's meeting in context, tonight's meeting is one of hundreds, literally it's one of hundreds that's taken place across the length and breadth of Scotland as the country discusses and decides upon the most important political question we've had to face in 300 years. So if you've not made up your mind, no pressure. 300 years of considering, now we're going to consider the issue of self-determination for Scotland. That's what this is about. And over the past 2 years when we've had the debate, we've all learned a great deal, many things, I'm sure we have. That's the engagement in political discussions, that's what happens. And you've probably learned, hopefully you've learned, that Britain isn't a country. Britain isn't a country. Britain's a political union made up of 4 countries. Scotland, on the other hand, we are a country. We're a nation. We're not a region or a province of anywhere else. And these are revelations, aren't they? They're revelations every time you turn on the BBC. I listened to Radio 4 a couple of weeks ago. Remember when the British Cabinet came to Aberdeen? And they said it's the 3rd time ever that the British Cabinet have been in Scotland. And I heard Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat Energy Secretary, being interviewed on Radio 4. I lie in my bed, I listen to the Today programme, and Ed Davey says, it's great to be here. This country's going through a period where we have to address rising gas and electric bills, etc. And I remember thinking, they're in Aberdeen. Ed Davey is talking about this country. Everybody lying in their bed this morning who lives in Scotland thinks he's talking about Scotland. And Ed Davey thinks he's talking about Britain. He thinks he's talking about this country in British context. And of course, Ed Davey's probably a bit slow. Maybe he's got dyslexia, I couldn't tell you. But he hasn't understood that Britain is a political union, and in the world today that's an oddity. It's not at all common. On the other hand, free, independent countries, that is the norm. There's 260 other countries in the world who already have their right to self-determination. They are independent countries. And this debate that we're having is simply to say Scotland and the people of Scotland are going to choose our right to determine our own future. Self-determination. And you know, in the past few months it's been interesting. You barely see Alistair Darling. I don't know if he lives in Coldstream. I've never seen him for ages. But we trotted out Gordon Brown, and then he trotted out John Reid, don't they? Dr. John Reid, very clever man. Don't know if he's as clever as Nigel, but look, Dr. Reid comes on the television and he says, hold on, I says, of course Scotland's entitled to self-determination. Of course Scotland's entitled to its right to determine its own future. It's just we're saying we don't think you should exercise it. And of course this is really important because I stand here as a socialist, and I think this is a theme Nigel rightly puts in front of the meeting. And I want to reassure you, supporting Scotland's democratic right to self-determination does not make you a Scottish nationalist. It makes you a Democrat. This is a democratic question. This is about Scotland's democratic right to determine our future in the same way that those 260 other countries do already. That's simply what it's about. And the Scottish Socialist Party is delighted to be part of the Yes Scotland coalition that we helped to found, together with the Scottish National Party and the Greens, and all the partners that have joined it and play such an important part in it. But the Scottish Socialist Party stands in the same traditions as John Maclean, the leader of the Red Clydesiders 100 years ago, and James Connolly, perhaps the most famous socialist Edinburgh's ever produced after me. James Connolly and John Maclean 100 years ago advocated independence for Scotland, but nobody who knows anything about John Maclean or James Connolly would ever describe them as nationalists. They weren't. They were internationalists, like Nigel. But they understood that the desire for independence, the achievement of independence, was a step towards a progressive step forward to emancipate working class people in this country. And the Scottish Socialist Party humbly suggesting we stand in the same tradition going back 100 years. And independence, people say to me, what's this debate about? I was in Princess Street today. I'm in Princess Street mostly every day. I say to people, that's where I have my surgery. And the people in Edinburgh will say, oh, there's that guy. And I go, do you mean the leader, the longest serving leader in Scotland? Do you mean that guy who used to represent the Lothians in the Parliament? No, you're that guy at East End of Princess Street every day doing that stall in independence. I pass you in the bus. And I make clear to people when I get the chance to speak to them, what's this debate about? Simple. Independence means that working people like us, working class people like us, will be better off. That's why you should vote for it. The working class majority in this country will be economically better off, socially better off, and politically better off. And I want to justify that claim in my remarks, short as they are tonight, put them in front of you. Why do I say it? First of all, because, as Nigel and Ash have already made clear, this is a very wealthy country. Scotland, potentially, according to the OECD, could be the 14th wealthiest, richest country in the world. An independent Scotland would be richer than France is today. An independent Scotland would be richer than Japan is today, than Italy is today, than the rest of the UK will be, measured in GDP per head of the population. And the reason they draw that conclusion is because, like all these rich countries in the world, Scotland has a wide and diverse array of industries and wealth-creating sectors. We talk about the oil and gas industry, and I'm not really going to cover it much in my remarks here. We have oil and gas in the North Sea. We're very fortunate that it's in our sector. It's very important to us. I'm not really going to say too much about it, but the other side of this campaign will tell you that oil, Colin, honest to God, it's going to run out tomorrow. By this time tomorrow it'll probably have gone. And by the way, it's only worth about 4p in the world exchanges. That's the part they put in front of you. And the reality is, 95% of the countries of the world would give their eye teeth for Scotland's gas and oil reserves, running into many trillions of pounds
for the next 3 or 4 or 5 decades. That's the reality with gas and oil, and it's important you remember it. But as well as oil and gas, we have world-class financial services. We have world-class information technology. I look around the room, I'm not too sure how many people here play Grand Theft Auto. Put up your hand if you play Grand Theft Auto. Put up your hand if you know what I'm talking about, right? right, I'm actually with you. I've got a 14-year-old boy and he tells me about Grand Theft Auto, the latest game. It's not important you know about it, but it is important you know it was developed in Scotland. It's worth billions of pounds, developed in Dundee and Edinburgh, and indicates the wealthy information technology industry we have, and indicates the most important and precious resource we have in Scotland is not the oil and gas, it's not the whisky, it's not the salmon in the River Tweed, it's not the Aberdeen Angus, it's not life sciences, it's not information technology, it's you! It's the people of Scotland ourselves, talented, educated, resourceful, full of initiative. We've shown over centuries we're able to solve problems. We gave the world the Enlightenment, remember. I don't stand in front of you as a chauvinist. I'm not a nationalist. I don't say, Scots, we're better than everybody else. We're not better than everybody else. But we're not worse than everybody else either. I didn't choose to be born in Murrow. It was the luck of the draw. I would have been happy if I was born in Buenos Aires or Johannesburg or Beijing. I happen to be Scottish. I understand my history, I understand my people, and I understand what we've contributed to the world. And we're able to say, when you wrap all that together, we can be confident in ourselves and our ability to run our country and maximise its potential, and to maximise the potential of the 5.2 million people who live here. So for me, this isn't a debate about whether Scotland would be a wealthy country or not. It stands to reason when you think about it. If all the taxes you pay, all the national insurance you pay, all the income tax you pay, all the national insurance contributions, capital gains tax, corporation tax, the duty on alcohol, tobacco, petrol, think of all the taxes you pay. If they stayed here in Scotland instead of being siphoned off by the UK Treasury, it stands to reason we'd be better off. And I only put these in front of you because the no side would have you believe that an independent Scotland would be some kind of economic basket case, that would be left to eat porridge all day and drink whisky all night. That if it wasn't for England, we would be subsidy junkies and we couldn't look after ourselves. And of course, it's nonsense. It's an arrant nonsense. Scotland is a wealthy country, and the key to this debate is about what we can then do with that wealth. Because in Scotland today, under the Union, we have some very serious social problems. 1/3 of the children that Ash is talking about in Glasgow live in poverty in the 21st century, and potentially the 14th richest country in the world. And what does that mean, poverty? Nowadays, in this context, it means there are 1 in 3 children in Glasgow who don't have a special pair of shoes for the winter. They wear the same trainers in the winter they wear in the summer. The kids that are constantly not well, not properly nourished, who live in damp housing, who don't get the chance to go on the school trips that other kids take for granted. 1 in 3 in our biggest city. That's an outrage. That's a scandal. It's A, not ever going to change under the Union, and it is B, something that we are going to address and eradicate in an independent Scotland, because this represents the social democratic values Nigel was talking about, that is the centre of gravity of people in Scotland. We've made it repeatedly clear. We elect left of centre, social democratic and socialist governments and politicians in this country. I know you've got that very rare beast here in Coldstream, use the word beast advisedly, that Tory MSP in the Scottish Parliament. And it's a rare thing in Scotland because we reject that philosophy. We have a government, as you know, Westminster, we didn't elect them. On Princess Street, when I'm in the megaphone, I say, vote yes on the 18th of September and send a message to David Cameron that after the 18th of September, there will not be any more David Cameron in Scotland. There will not be any more Tory governments we didn't elect. No more bedroom cat tax that we didn't vote for. No poll tax that we didn't vote for. No Trident nuclear weapons stationed in our soil. No laddies for the border sent to die in illegal wars for the British Empire. Their days are over. We're going to construct the kind of country we want to live in, that serves our social democratic and socialist values. That's what this debate's about. It's clear. It's a choice. You can have the Union, continued privatisation, continued attacks on claimants and immigrants, scapegoating them for a crisis that was caused by the bankers. And these are the values people in Scotland want to see continue. And I have to say, see, when I listen to the No campaign on the television, I must remember, you know, John Reid, Alistair Darling, Gordon Brown, they remind me of Private Fraser in Dad's Army. Do you remember Private Fraser? We're doomed, Captain Mannering, we're doomed. Our oil's about to run out, our pensions are useless, our currency will never be able to spend. If you vote yes on the 18th of September, the sun will never shine in Coldstream again. That's what they put forward, and it's the ridiculous of frontiers. And actually, what they're arguing here is that they say, Nigel, Ash, Alec, Scotland gets the best of all possible worlds as things stand. We have a strong Scottish Parliament there at Holyrood and vital influence at the international table because of our presence at Westminster. And I have to bring you the news. As Alec mentioned, I was in the Scottish Parliament for 4 years. My daily experience was to get the number 31 bus from my street straight down to the Parliament to be told by George Reid, who was the presiding officer then, Colin, you can't talk about unemployment in here. You can't talk about the national minimum wage in here. You can't talk about pouring ashes water all over the salt dryer in here. You can't talk about Afghanistan in here. You can't talk about equality for men and women in here. That's for the big boys and girls at Westminster. You just keep playing with your toys. We don't have a Scottish Parliament that's strong powers. That's what this whole debate's about. And neither do we have vital influence at Westminster, because if we did, we didn't want the Royal Mail to be privatised. They did it anyway. We didn't want a second generation of trident nuclear weapons outside of Glasgow threatening the rest of the world with nuclear annihilation. They did it anyway. They occupied Afghanistan, we didn't want it, they did it anyway. We don't have vital influence at the top table. And you know, the latest ruse that they've come forward with saying, look, vote no and we'll bring you more powers for the Scottish Parliament. That's the latest wheeze, isn't it? We'll bring you more powers for the Scottish Parliament. You go, well, where are they? Well, you know, Mikey, I've got a couple of buttons here, a couple of buttons there. And it reminds me, it's like when you listen to the Devo Max proposals, very vague, very minuscule, and it reminds me like going into the local car dealership when you want to buy a car, and you say to the salesman, I want to buy a new car. Oh, Mr. Fox, we've got an ideal car for you here. Look, this is the new Ford Devo Max, and it's ideal for you. And you go, that car's only got 2 wheels. Yes, but it's got all the power that you find necessary, all the power that you'll need. And of course you say, I want a car with 4 wheels, that everybody else takes for granted. That's what Devo Max is. They're offering us something that's not going to solve all the problems. It's not going to address the issues. It's not going to eradicate the child poverty, the fuel poverty in this part of the world, the chronic shortage of affordable housing. It's not going to eradicate the 1,000 food banks that are in Scotland. It's not going to eradicate the chronic low pay that the border suffers from, the lowest wages in the whole of this country. It's not going to change with those powers because they're not offering us anything worth a damn. And I have to say to you, the reality is that if we want to be in charge of our own country, we've got to vote yes on the 18th of September. And I've only got some of my notes that are dry. Concentrate on the dry parts of the left. And say this to you, I want to see an independent Scotland where the wealth of the country is owned by the people, not faceless corporations who take decisions and just cast tens of thousands of people in towns and villages across the country to the 4 winds. I want to see a country where no one is left behind, where we don't have child poverty, where senior citizens living in poverty who have given their life to this country. I want to see full employment on a living wage with trade union rights taken for granted. I want to see a modern democratic republic for Scotland where we the people are sovereign and we have an elected head of state that's representative of the people and accountable to the people. But understand entirely, none of that's possible without a yes vote on the 18th of September. That's what comes first. And so my plea to you, and I'm sure my fellow panellists would say the same, I'm asking you to vote yes on the 18th of September. I'm asking you to get involved in the Yes campaign and help persuade your family and friends, colleagues at work and others to do the same. And I want you to say one final thing. Promise yourself, tonight, promise yourself that when Scotland wakes up on the 19th of September and has voted for independence, you can turn to your wife, your husband, your partner, your son and daughter, your colleagues at work, your family and friends and say, I did that, I changed the world forever. Thank you very much.
Has anyone got a cloth out there we could use, please? I'd just like to thank our guest speakers again for their, for their remarks today. Hopefully one of the key messages that we're trying to get across here, and I'm sure everyone knows this in this room, this is not about the SNP. This is not about Alex Salmond. I'm sure you hear that constantly, trying to personalise the argument, trying to make it one man's cause against everyone else's. Hopefully you heard from all the speakers here. We come from all different backgrounds, wide diverse occupations, but we agree on one thing, that we'd like to see a yes vote in September for our country. So before we finish with a little cup of tea or coffee, can I please encourage you to fill in this questionnaire. Tonight, very much, as Colin alluded, it's not about us. We know what we're doing in September. It's about you, the good people of Coldstream. We'd very much like you to invite you to take part in this debate tonight by filling in these questionnaires and handing it to one of my colleagues during the interval. So now it's about 8:30. Can I suggest we have a 15-minute break for a cup of tea and coffee? The shortbread is excellent, by the way. It's homemade, so I do recommend it. That's my mother clapping there, by the way. You can still make it a family affair. So please have a cup of tea or coffee, have a chat with us, help yourself to all the literature we have there. You're more than welcome. There's car stickers, badges, window signs as well. And we can reconvene in about 15 minutes for what I would regard the most important part of the evening, hearing from yourselves. Okay, thank you very much. What I was trying to say to you outside was, if you suddenly decided to maybe go and live in Spain, what would happen to your pension? It would go with me, she said. So what would happen if you live in Scotland? I wouldn't get it. You do what you do. You thank her for the time. And just leave it there. Be courteous, respectful at all times. But as you sometimes take it personally, we shouldn't. But she came along and listened to us. She's left, but she's still voting no. So anyway, silly. I'd like to move on to some of the questions that were submitted to us tonight, and I'll just read them as they come, and really I'll just invite our panel just to respond to them as best they can. If there are circumstances, and we say this everywhere we go, and I think a lady, we just actually encountered it, where a lady asked us a question about some particular point on the leaflet. We couldn't answer it because we don't have all the answers, and I maybe alluded to, we're not necessarily professional politicians. If we don't have the answer, we're more than happy to get back to you, to get your contact details, and we'll try and give you some sort of resolution to the question if we can. That's what it's all about. So anyway, moving on from me. Got a number of questions tonight, and really what I'd like to do is maybe touch the questions from the sort of forms you filled in, maybe get a response from our panel, but very much throw open to the floor as well. So if anyone would like to come back with any comments, any further questions. We have a roving mic, my colleague Ian at the back. Please, it would really help us if you use the mic because we can pick it up for the video. In the past where we haven't used a mic, we've had panellists responding to questions and don't know what the question is. So if you don't mind, if you've got a strong objection, it's up to you. Equally, as I may have alluded at the start, we'd be quite happy to maybe get you in the video as well. If you don't want to, please let us know and we won't do it. But this is just going out on YouTube, unedited, and you can go home tonight and see yourselves, and it'll go all over the world. Isn't that beautiful? That's what it's all about, really. So, thank you very much. I think our first question tonight, if you don't mind, is from Pat Rowe, and it's about the sort of subject area was the bank failure back in 2008, 2009, and it's a reasonably pertinent question because it's one we're asked quite a lot about as well. So perhaps I can address this to Nigel, if you don't mind initially, Nigel.
No.
Okay, and then I'll just sort of run down through the panel for me. And the question is, was RBS not the first large bank to start the scandal?
I have to confess, I don't know whether it was was the first one, or indeed whether it was a British bank that was the first one. But the point is that RBS, just like HBOS, is a British bank, not a Scottish bank, except in name. Where a bank fails or gets into trouble, what happens is that there is an international bailout. The international character of it is caused by the outreach of the bank's business. So it is a fact that the major payer of the bank bailouts in this country was not Scotland, was not the Treasury, it was the US Federal Reserve, which paid far more for the bailing out of British banks than the British Treasury did. The exposure of the Scottish Government to any such bank failures would be proportionate to where the business was done. And in all of those cases, it would not have amounted to more than 10% of the bailout. Furthermore, you ought to remember that an independent Scottish Government would have been benefiting from the taxation that would have been paid by those banks to an independent Scottish Government over the preceding years. And if you do the sums on that, you will find that if you had imagined that the Scottish Government had been receiving the income from the taxation over a period of 10 years, it would not only have covered the bailout, it would have been in profit despite the bailout. That's my answer in brief.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering why the crisis happened in the first place. Cast your mind back that what happened was that these banks, the Royal Bank of Scotland, Bradford and Bingley, Northern Rock, as Nigel said in America, they were caught red-handed, involved in greedy, reckless bubbles where they were lending people money who didn't have the wherewithal to pay it back, speculating on housing prices. And I think that's the starting point for this for me. I remember Gordon Brown, time after time after time after time, was that boring? Time after time, standing up in the Parliament, Westminster, and saying, we've ended the boom-bust cycle of capitalism in this country. It's a prolonged growth in the economy, 25 consecutive quarters. And it was based in a fictitious bubble. That the idea that our houses would just increase in value, no relation to reality whatsoever, and they're back at it again. You can see it. House prices in London up another 21% last year. House prices, I mean, I live in Edinburgh. I spoke at the Edinburgh Tenants Federation AGM just a couple of weeks ago, and I quipped, £1 million houses are 10 a penny in Edinburgh. In other words, you go along the street, that house is £1 million, that house is £1 million, that house is £1 million. You look at them, and frankly, you wouldn't give them tuppence for the house. But apparently they're worth £1 million. And of course, what happened was, the banks were making a fortune. You could lie about how much your salary was and get 4 times it, 5 times it, 6 times it to get a mortgage that they made money on. And I have to say, the Labour government made the catastrophic error of deregulating the banks. Do what you like, make as much money as you like. The Royal Bank of Scotland, let's not forget, was the richest bank in the world, the most profitable bank in the world. When I was in the Scottish Parliament, they gathered together the MSPs for the Lothians and they whistled at us like that time. and the Royal Bank of Scotland chap came along and he says, isn't it marvellous that the world's richest bank is based in Edinburgh? And I remember saying to him, yeah, and you know what, see if the Scottish Socialist Party comes to power, we're going to take the Royal Bank of Scotland back into public hands. Should be publicly owned. And Sir Jeremy Peake, his name was, and he laughed and he said, I don't think that'll ever happen. Shows you what he knows. It's now owned by the public, isn't it? The difference is we nationalise the debts, not the assets. That's the root cause of this problem. And I want to see the Royal Bank of Scotland, when it returns to profitability, remain in public hands so that the profits can be used to build houses, provide jobs, and future generations with employment. That's the answer to this question. And that's the lesson to learn above all others.
Thank you, Colin. Ashley, anything to add to that?
I would just say that the way that Better Together spin this all the time is like, you know, stick with us. If there's another problem, then we'll be able to deal with it. But really, the question is, why is there a problem? And so if we were an independent Scotland, we could regulate, we would prevent any crashes coming in the future. Whereas if we stick with the UK, what they're basically saying to us is stick with us, and when there is another crash, because they haven't regulated, so there will be another crash coming down the line, we'll take your money from the ordinary working person in Scotland and put it together with the money from the ordinary working person in England and use that to bail out the banks. That's not a system that I want to be involved in, and I don't think it's good for Scotland.
Thank you. Any comments from the floor? Any questions? Anything maybe sort of surrounding the banking crisis that we're going through, or have been going through?
You're based, and I don't think they are. They're all members of a club, and they've got their hands on the money, and they're not going to let it go. Got their hands on the power, they're not going to let it go. And they're the same in Scotland as they are
I don't think they are
anywhere else.
I mean, for my job, I go and speak to the Scottish politicians, and I'll give you an example. So I'm basically and I'm representing a think tank that is quite small. It's not very well known, or it was when I first started it last year. And I'll be waiting in reception at the Scottish Parliament. And in one case, the chief whip from the SNP came down to reception to collect me himself. Can you imagine that happening at Westminster? There's not the same number of public school boys there, and it'd be our job in an independent Scotland to make sure that these politicians are responsive to us in the way that they should be. Not this type of democracy that we have at the moment, which is basically you're just checking a box when you haven't really got a choice. A real participative democracy where the people are in charge and the people get to exercise real power over the people that we elect into power over us.
Could I add something to that? I entirely understand deep scepticism about the quality of politicians. Anybody who's lived through the last 50 years is going to share that with you. I do agree that I get a totally different feel dealing with senior Scottish politicians from the feel that one gets in trying to communicate, never mind dealing with senior Westminster politicians. However, I think the important thing to recognise is that in Scotland we can have an immediacy of access to our political leaders which is not possible in the much larger country of the United Kingdom. It is also much easier of access in terms of location. The remoteness of London from virtually everywhere in the UK is a perpetual problem. And I think it's important to recognise that while I admire the idealism of what Colin is saying about the banks and would like to think that it could be so, the important point to recognise in this argument over whether it is sensible or not to go our own way in the relation to banks is we have the chance, if we are independent, to set up a new banking regulation structure. There is absolutely no sign of that happening at Westminster at all, no matter which party is in power. If we are independent, we are not threatened by an inability to deal with banking crashes because they are being, I'm sorry, I can't use diplomatic language, being lied about by the No campaign in suggesting that the burden would fall entirely on Scotland. That is simply nonsense, and it's important that we recognise that. But cynicism about politicians, well, I think we all share it to some degree. But at least they'll be our politicians and a damn sight nearer us than they are in Westminster.
Anyone else would like to add anything or make a comment on the banking situation as well at the moment? Okay, thank you. I'll move on to it. I actually found a question on, I was alluding to the pension debate I was having outside, so perhaps it's pertinent that I'll pick up on it now. Margot Craig. Margot's question is, paid in England, maybe I've addressed to you, Colin, if you don't mind to start with. Paid in England, live in Scotland for 25 years, what is the future? Pensions.
Well, I think the yes side in this contest here have made absolutely clear. As things stand, your pension is facing a triple whammy. You're going to have to work longer, you're going to have to put in more into it, and you're going to have to expect less when it matures. That does come down the line. And the Yes campaign have made it absolutely clear that dignity in retirement is central to the values that we have in Scotland. Our reward as a country for people who've worked their whole life for this country is to ensure they don't have to suffer the indignity of fuel poverty, the indignity of watching a pension decrease in value because of inflation and
rises in prices, etc. And they basically have said, we are going to ensure that there won't be a triple whammy. We're not going to see people in Scotland whose life expectancy, as Ash has already demonstrated, is less than England in particular, work longer. Otherwise they're going to just no see a pension at all. They'll be dead before it matures. And we're not going to have people paying in more and expecting less, because that's not sufficient to live on. And we want to see our pension, people in retirement living in dignity, and as far as we're concerned, that's central to the values of social democracy. And the pensioners' organisations in Scotland who back yes have said the pension has to be linked, not just to inflation, it has to be linked to a rise in wages for everybody else, so it doesn't fall further and further behind. And I have to say, it's one of those areas where it's black and white between the futures you've been offered by yes and the grim triple whammy you've been offered by the no side.
Yeah, I mean, I take it that part of the question is a concern that if one has lived and worked in England and has acquired a professional work pension in England, what is the situation for one's pension if there is independence? I'm in precisely that position. My pension was earned in England and I live here. I am delighted to vote yes. I know that my pension will be paid. It doesn't make any difference. I might have chosen to move, well I do actually. I live not quite half the year, about 4 months of the year. I have a house, I live in Italy. My pension is not threatened by the fact that I live abroad. I have an excellent friend who, a Scottish Episcopal priest, who had a career in Scotland, in England and in Belgium, and lived for a long time in France, and was tax resident in France. His pensions were quite complicated, but all of them have been paid, no matter which country he's been living in. It makes no difference.
Can I ask,
yes.
By whom? Is it a British organisation? Is it English or is it Scottish?
Well, in his case, he had 3 pensions. One from the Scottish Episcopal Church, one from the Church of England, and 2 further ones from his employment by the Bishopric of Europe in Belgium, and that was a church pension, and he has a Belgian state pension as well. So he's got a collection of bits and pieces from all these different places, and he had them when he lived in France. He's got them now that he's back living in Perth.
Right. So it doesn't really matter where you actually live.
No.
It still comes from a reliable source.
It's a commercial contract. It's a contract, exactly. It's a contract. You've paid in,
Yeah.
and you are due the pension, and you will be paid it no matter where you are.
Thank you.
I can accept that with a private pension, but I think people are more concerned about state pension and state earnings-related pension.
Well, that's even easier to answer.
Well, given what happened with Australia, where they've now had a rise as people emigrated, it was frozen, it never increased after that. Is it the fact that the Scottish Government will then pay your state pension and your state earnings-related pension?
No,
That still have to come from Westminster.
no, the truth, and it's an extreme. It's a bonus for Scotland in terms of independence, because our state pensions are in fact paid not as a result of insurance, as Gordon Brown tries to make out, but paid out of taxation, and it is a contract which has been entered into by the state. We already have a statement, clear statement from the Pensions Minister in London that the state pension will not be affected by a yes vote. People will be paid their state pensions. That will go on no matter what happens. What is bizarrely interesting is that for the next 20 years, roughly, we will see state pensions being paid out by the Westminster Treasury to Scots after a yes vote. In other words, a large portion of Scotland's normal welfare expenditure will not be coming out of the Scottish budget, but out of Westminster's after our independence. Now, it may go on like that, or that may turn out to be a bargaining chip in the negotiations that follow a yes vote. But it's a bargaining chip which is a huge one in the Scottish Government's hands. And the only way in which your state pension would be affected in future would be if a Westminster Government was to decide to change the terms of the deal. And we all know Westminster can decide to do what it likes. There's this dotted English doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament, so that they can do anything at any point. But subject to that, and we can't predict the future, subject to that, there is no threat to anybody's pension, private or state.
Can I just ask, in terms of the welfare benefit system, if Scotland is independent, Scotland be establishing its own welfare benefit system?
I would hope so. But at the moment,
because that would be, it's an extremely complex and difficult system to administer, and obviously to set up there would be duplication in costs if it was set up in Scotland as well, and it's trying to duplicate what's actually set up and run in England or in Westminster. But it's running, there's different areas.
But obviously we're paying for that already, aren't we? But the jobs are not in Scotland.
Yes, a lot of the jobs are in Scotland.
Yeah,
that's what I was going to
But
say.
not all of them.
You've got, no, not all of them, but you do have a lot of jobs that are in Scotland that are related to the British welfare benefit system. So are you saying that once Scotland goes on its own, that you would be setting up a new and a fresh system to administer benefits? Because from what Colin's saying, what you'd be looking at would be having, and I mean, I think the aims that he's looking for the pension are laudable, but you'd be looking at a different type of pension system than actually exists at the moment. Because otherwise, you would still continue, if the system remains as it is administered by UK, and if that's agreeable, I don't know if that's a bargaining chip, but that's not going to change with an independent Scotland.
I mean, the answer is inevitably messy, because we're talking about something that really depends upon how negotiations go. We could get much clearer answers to these sorts of things if the Westminster Government had been prepared to have any pre-negotiations. They have refused to do that, undoubtedly for political reasons. We are left with inevitably speculation. As you rightly say, there are a lot of people in Scotland employed in dealing with the UK's benefit system already. And therefore it is highly likely that what will happen is that there will be some sort of bargaining over the running of the benefits and welfare system, which will take account of the fact that many benefits in south of the border are administered by Scottish staff at the moment. In other words, it's not a one-way traffic, it's a two-way traffic. The other point I would make is what Professor Dunleavy of LSE has said about this, which is that if you were to thunderclap overnight, decide to completely replace the benefit and welfare system, you would be running up a bill of a considerable size, round about £900 million. But in fact, what you would do would be to phase that over a period of time. For example, there are parts of the benefit system which require new administrative systems being devised and put in now. New computer systems, for example. Now, you're not going to go out and use the old system. He, very interestingly, used the example of if your laptop or your desktop computer went FUT, you wouldn't go out and try to buy the model that you bought five years ago. You would design a new one. You would take a new design that would do a better job. So the cost that he's talking about is something that would apply not overnight, but over a period of about 10 or 20 years. And the result would be that you would emerge with your own benefit system and a better one, but of course it would take time and it would take money. That kind of thing is not going to be simply changed overnight with a yes vote. It will, however, mean that there is a negotiation which will take account of the fact that many of the things in the benefit system are actually run from Scotland at the moment for people south of the border. So there would be a trade-off.
But I think it's that uncertainty that is a concern and a worry for people.
Well, it's not. It is not a concern that would affect their present pension and their present value of their pension. The business of building a new kind of pension, of which people have spoken, which I totally am sympathy with, is something that would be done progressively. It wouldn't be done overnight. We can't expect to become a Scandinavian country in one jump. It will take time.
Could I just add, I think one thing's clear and obvious is 2014 isn't year zero. We're not starting from nowhere. You know, we inherit a lot of this. You've paid into this, as Nigel has said, you've been paying into this pension contract for decades. That will continue to accrue to you when we're independent. I think in due course, as independence becomes year 1, 5 years into independence, we will evolve into a different benefit system. It seems to be if our values are different from down south, then the benefit system will reflect that. If we're saying that we're not going to have senior citizens living in poverty, that's a big commitment, not least of all because remember, the overwhelming majority of our welfare payments go in pensions. That's why I've got no time for this hobby horse, actually it's worse than that, scapegoating people who are unemployed and claimants. Because the overwhelming huge proportion of the welfare budget pays pensions. And nobody in their right mind is going to say we're going to cut that, are they? They think they can cut income support or job seekers allowance from £65. Pitiful. So, you know, my view would, we're not starting from year zero, we've inherited this, it will continue to play its part, but in due course as we become independent year 1, year 5, year 10, I think it's quite right that we evolve into a system that's more suited to our needs. And if I can just say one thing, which I think you've also rightly touched on, in these negotiations after the 18th of September to May 9, 2016, one of the things we'll look at is the British Civil Service. By the way, I lived in London for 10 years and the British Civil Service is nowhere near as devolved out of the southeast of England as it ought to be. But nonetheless, we've got the National Insurance Contribution Centre at Long Benton, we've got centres in parts of Scotland, you've got the DVLC, DVLA in Swansea, and one of the negotiations will be, maybe we'll just keep the DVLA at Swansea, maybe it will just continue to serve the rest of the UK and Scotland. There might be economies of scale in doing so. So there'll be negotiations for those civil servants, for example, to say you can remain in Scotland and the rest of the UK agency, or we might say, like for example, the Forestry Commission's headquarters are in Edinburgh. So that might again maintain a UK-wide remit, so to speak. But that's subject to negotiations based on what we think is best for our economy, our jobs, and the civil services performance. Going ahead. Does that make sense? You look curious.
Yeah, I'm just interested in what you have to say.
Good, it's good to be curious.
Yeah. Thank you, that was excellent. Really appreciate your contribution to that. The lady at the front, John.
We've heard a lot about worries about pensions and better together or no thanks or whatever. Keep trying to frighten people, I reckon, with this. However, what we don't hear about very often is George Osborne's latest proposals about allowing people to take all or pretty much all of their pot of the industrial pensions or personal pensions. Now, I understand that there is and can be very big tax implications if people take them out, and that's not been explained to people. People are being encouraged to think that they can go away and buy a Ferrari or a yacht or whatever, or a dinghy. You know, my choice would be a Maserati actually, but can I afford that one?
Mine's outside.
I'll have a run in it later. Now, this wouldn't, I assume, be something that Scotland would ever contemplate doing. We would be a bit more sensible.
Canny.
Well, I think with regards to the welfare system, for me that's a huge opportunity for us to do things differently. I mean, if you look at the way we're setting things up at the moment, so we've got a huge number of low-paid workers which are not contributing an awful lot to the economy. They're being subsidised out of the public purse because they're not being paid. You can work for 40 hours a week in Scotland and you're not taking home enough money to feed, clothe and house your family. Now that's not any way to run an economy. We're then paying to subsidise these people out of our revenue from Scotland. And it's actually costing Scotland £250 million a year. Now, if we instituted a living wage and we made these employers that can well afford it, in most cases, pay proper wages to people so that they were able to contribute more to the economy, then that could revolutionise the welfare system as it is at the moment. If we went back to completely universal benefits, they're much cheaper to administer. So the way that the welfare system is developing in the UK, it's very convoluted, it's very complicated, it's hugely inefficient, and it's more expensive than it should be. So I think there's opportunities there in Scotland to reimagine the way that we do things in a different way and make it work for us much better.
I'd like to move on from there unless there's any final points on the pension. I knew we'd get a good crowd in Coldstream. Excellent questions, thank you. Another question for the panel. This is to everybody really for me. Walter Gray, thank you for your question. Each speaker was excellent in their own way.
Well done,
Well done, guys. Doesn't finish there though. There's the ego bit. Okay, but spoken generalities. It's very nice to live dreams, but the reality of making them come true needs realism. And it's a question I do recognise. It's something that's perhaps placed at the yes door on a reasonably regular basis. So, excellent individual speeches, guys. Generalistic, we need to live in the real world. How are we going to make all these things come true? Ash?
I think personally, I think that's unfair to put that at the yes door, because I think if you actually listen to many of the proponents of the other side of the argument, you will find, and I've listened to quite a few of them, I've debated with a few of them, that quite often, Michael Moore, I'll give him as an example, gave a speech recently that I attended, and he spoke for about 15 to 20 minutes, and it was entirely content-free. So I think there's very little, well it was, there's very little coming forward from them. It's basically just a load of scare stories and so on. And I think I follow various media, online blogs and so on, because I feel you get a different side of the story there. And most often, many of the things that are being put forward by the other side are easily debunked. You can look at the facts, you can look things up online yourself. So I think that's unfair to say that we're all just dreamy and so on. I think we do have a positive vision. I think a common meal is a good example. That's something that people could look at. You can go through the book and look at our proposals for national investment for industry, different types of universal benefits. We've got 21 new industries that Scotland could invest in to grow our economy in a different way. If anybody wants to hear about them, I'm more than happy to talk about them later. So I think we've got a lot of facts and figures at our disposal. The primary one obviously being about our economy and how we'd be the 14th richest country in the world. These things are indisputable. The Financial Times, no friend to the Yes campaign, is coming out with these figures for us. So I think we've got a good solid basis there. And if we need to maybe just lift our head a bit, stay out of the weeds, look up and think about what kind of country we want to be and how good it could be to get there. Because I think what we don't realise a lot in the UK is, by a lot of standards, we are very unusual in the European context. In many areas, we've just been talking about pensions, we have the lowest pensions in Europe. You don't hear that much from the No campaign, do you? We've got the most expensive childcare costs in Europe, most expensive energy, and so, the list goes on and on and on. So I think we've got so much more to gain than we have got to lose.
Can I just say this to Walter? and I'll come to the central point that you said, but Oscar Wilde once said something really profoundly important. Show me a world without utopia in it. Show me a world without utopia in it, and I'll show you a world that's not worth living in. You've got to have dreams, you've got to have ambition, you've got to have aspirations. Too many of our politicians will come to Coldstream and tell you what you can't. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't have equality for men and women. Women can't have the vote. Jim Sillars, when he's coming to Eyemouth in a couple of weeks' time, come and see him. He makes a really tremendously important point about an Iron Bevan. And an Iron Bevan's famous word was audacity.
audacity. You need your politicians to have a vision, to be brave, to change the world. And an Iron Bevan, remember, is known probably, above all, he's known for the man who's established the National Health Service. Maybe in hindsight, that's too much to lay at his door, but leave that aside for a second. He established and helped to establish the National Health Service in 1947, when this country was on its arse. Not on its knees. A Second World War, rationing, no housing. Consider Coldstream in 1945, 46, 47, and Britain as a whole. And along comes an Iron Bevan and says, do you know what? I'm going to introduce a National Health Service that means everybody in Coldstream and everybody in Cardiff and everybody in Cornwall is going to get free health care paid for out of general taxes. No more paying the doctor at the door when he came. You're 2 and 6, if you didn't pay him, you didn't get treated. And imagine at the time, all these people who've got no utopia in their eyes going, Mr. Bevan, have you lost the plot? Have you been drinking in the bezel there? Really, for goodness sake. And he did it. And I have to say to you, my mum worked in the National Health Service. She worked in Law Hospital in Kaluk her entire life. And I say this to you hand in heart. Westminster, 2014, they would never establish the National Health Service today. They haven't got the audacity, they haven't got the vision, they haven't got the commitment, they don't give a monkeys about working people, and they want to privatise the best thing that Britain and Scotland has got about it. So I take the question to heart and I value it, because really it's a challenge to say, Colin, Ash, Nigel, these things you're saying sound fantastic, but promises it's not just hot air for a public meeting in Coldstream. Go do it, go deliver it, make sure it happens, make sure it's not just so much political talk that never comes to anything. And I was in the Scottish Parliament for 4 years. I put forward a bill to abolish prescription charges. When I put it forward, it was voted down by the Labour Party, the Tories and the Liberals. To the SNP's immense credit, when I was asked to leave the Scottish Parliament by the good people of the Lothians, they picked it up and they implemented it. And frankly, I don't care whether it was me or it's them. It's not who did it, it's the fact that it happened. In Scotland, doesn't pay prescriptions because we refuse to see people who are ill pay twice for their medicines. It's not free. You pay for it with your taxes. But we're damn sure not going to see is that when you're sick, you pay for it a second time. But remember, in England today, across the bridge there, prescriptions are £8.05 per item on your prescription. Now, I like to say humbly, I played a part in that. And the Scottish Socialist Party also humbly say to you, and I know what Walter's driving at, there's a sense where politicians come here, promise you things, never deliver, don't trust them, don't like them, greasy, they're worse than bankers. When I was an MSP, I gave a commitment, as did all my Scottish Socialist Party colleagues, to live on a worker's wage. MSPs, when I was there, got £56,000 a year, and the average worker's wage in the Lothians, when I was an MSP, was £22,500, so I got £22,500. That was advice given not just to me and the Scottish Socialist Party, but to the socialist movement 100 years ago. But James Connolly said, you want to represent working people? Then you rise with your class, not out of them. You don't become elected as an MSP and then go to live the rich part of town, driving a nice big Maserati, going holidays to the Bahamas. You know the price of bread, you know the price of gas and electric bills, because you stand by the very people you seek to represent. And the 6 of us did it for 4 years, so you can't say it was just hot air, and we're proud of it.
I can't top that. But let me answer the question in terms of some hard facts. If you want hard facts about how it is that we could do the kind of things that Colin's talking about, not only because we hope that our politicians will have vision, but also because we know they will have the resources. There's no question about it. I gave you one figure, a couple of figures when I was talking. We won't be spending that 4.7 billion building HS2. We won't be spending over 1 billion extra every year on replacing Trident. If you just take a look at the present part of the Scottish budget that goes on defence, there's 800 million of the money that is spent on defence out of the Scottish budget that is not spent in Scotland in any way, shape or form that even the Treasury can think up. That is another 800 million that we have in our back pocket because we're not going to do things the way that they've been done in the past. So often the No campaign come out with another financial report that says this or that is not possible. They're all based on the ridiculous projection that an independent Scotland is going to go on with the same stupid spending priorities that the United Kingdom follows. That's precisely why we want independence, not to do that. So everywhere you look, there are massive savings. Let's take another one. Scotland has not run up the national debt with which the United Kingdom is burdened. We have not, for 30 out of the last 33 years, contributed a single penny to that debt. Yet we are paying debt charges out of Scottish revenue, in theory on paper, every year to the tune of billions of pounds. Even when there is a currency union, and there will be a currency union, they'll think up a new name for it, even when there is a currency union and we take a share of the national debt, if we took a population share, which would be pretty damn generous considering what we haven't run up ourselves, we would still be paying £1.8 billion a year less in debt repayment charges than we are paying now. Now, I don't know how many billion I've just run up in these few words, but in virtually every aspect that we look at, we know that Scotland can run more efficiently on the monies that Scotland raises. A new Scottish government will have an amplitude of real money to divert to new causes, some of the ones that we've been talking about socially so far. There is no question this is extremely well-founded. The more you look at the figures, the more convincing they are. And never mind me trying to dredge up figures, go to one particular website, Business for Scotland, run by small independent business people from small to medium enterprises. It's full of brilliant financial information, and as a historian I respect it because it always tells you where the information comes from. If you think it's too impressive, go check the sources and you'll find it's accurate. So.
Devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Can I just be devil's advocate here and say, if we're going to have all this money that we can do all these things with, why is John Spinney talking about borrowing the huge amounts of money that he's talking about borrowing, and which is going to produce a debt for our young people to have to pay in the future, presumably?
Well, if we cast our minds back to those far-off days before Mrs. Thatcher arrived in Downing Street, and indeed the days before Jim Callaghan made a disastrous speech in the mid-1970s when he said it was not possible to spend your way out of a recession. And we go back to remember some of the basics of Keynesian economics. The notion that borrowing to invest is bad news is nonsense from the Thatcher years. When Mrs. Thatcher first came to power and started to lay out her notion of economic policy, it's now forgotten that every professor of economics in Britain, bar only one, wrote a letter to the Times saying that this was economics turned upside down. What Swinney is talking about is being able to do what the Scottish Government has not been able to do, has not been allowed to do, namely to raise money for investment purposes. And my goodness me, we will be in a very strong position in raising that money, because we have behind us this huge natural resource, and that is why there will be a currency union as well. So it's not prodigal, it's sensible raising of funds in order to make progress and to reindustrialise and to regenerate this nation. Of course, they will also have those savings, but remember, you're also pressing us to say all these good social things that we want done. If we want to do the reinvesting and the good social things, then borrowing to invest is entirely sensible economics and the right way to go. And it's the opposite of the austerity programme, which, if there is a no vote, is guaranteed to bring £25 billion more cuts in public expenditure, to which both parties are signed up at Westminster.
If you don't mind, I'd like to move on, but thank you very much for those contributions. I'd like to try and get through a couple more questions. I'm conscious of time running on from us. Question from Joe, if I may, on welfare and specifically child poverty. It was reported yesterday on Radio 1, that 1 in 8 Borders children are living in poverty. How can I convince others that yes can go a long way to address this? Thanks. Very polite, Joe. Thank you very much. Ash, would you like to come in now?
Yep. I mean, if we're talking, we have to go back to investment as well. So what Nigel's saying is right, that investment in Britain is so bad at the moment that if you take depreciation and increasing population, Britain doesn't actually invest anything at all, which seems impossible, but it's actually true that the total spend of businesses, individuals and the public sector is not even enough to maintain where we are at the moment. So you think, why am I telling you this? If you don't have enough jobs and investment in industry to support good paying jobs, you can't improve the economy and you can't lift people out of poverty. If you earn £43,000 or more in Scotland at the moment, you're doing better than 9 out of 10 Scots. So obviously, like we said before, we need to address welfare. I'm in favour of bringing back more universal benefits. I think we should introduce a living wage and we should force companies to do it. They'll scream and they'll say, we can't afford it, we can't afford to do this. It was the same thing when we told them they had to take children out of work. They were screaming about that then, it would affect their profits and so on. They can afford to do it and they will do it, but only if they're forced to do it. And if we do those things, we'll improve the economy and we will be lifting people out of poverty.
Colin.
I mean, I have to say, 1 in 8 children, the Borders, live in poverty, and you think, where are those children? What is the circumstances they're in? These are in families where maybe both parents are working, both parents are in low-paid employment. We now get more people in poverty in work than there is people unemployed, and we have circumstances where 860,000 people in Scotland, there's only 5.2 million of us in total, so 860,000 adults classified as low paid. They don't earn enough to pay their own rent, so the government gives them housing benefit. They get tax credits, they get family credits, and so you work it out for yourself. Somebody working for McDonald's, or Tesco's, or Asda, or the Co-op, or whatever, they don't pay them enough. These employers don't pay them enough to pay their own rent, so taxpayers have to give them money to pay their own rent. Taxpayers have to give them money for tax credits and for family credits. And in effect, taxpayers are subsidising these employers. Some of the richest employers in Britain are getting subsidised by the government because they pay such paltry and appalling wages to their staff. And I think it's one of those economic factors that I think everybody in Scotland knows it. The Borders has got the lowest wages in the whole country. The Borders suffers disproportionate pain in this regard than the rest of the Central Belt, or the Highlands even, or the North East. The Borders of Scotland suffers dreadfully from low pay, chronic pay. So when Ash is saying a living wage, guaranteed hours, full employment, trade union rates of pay, trade union rights and conditions, it stands to reason the Borders is proportionately going to gain more than other parts of the country, because they're further behind to start with. And I think, the fact that there's 1 in 8 children in the Borders living in poverty is a scandal. It's eradicatable, is that a word? We can get rid of it, because it's man-made. If it's man-made, it can be man or gender-unspecific, person unmade. And we have to give a commitment to those children that are going. All the educational professionals I speak to say, if you don't intervene before that child is 5, the damage is done for the rest of their life. It's too late. So it shows you how important nursery provision is. It shows you how important free school meals are. It shows you how important milk at schools are. Nigel, Thatcher became notoriety. She gained notoriety in the first place because she was known in Lanarkshire when I grew up as
Thatcher, the milk snatcher. She was the education secretary in Heath's government who took away free school milk for the kids. An attack on youngsters, you know, milk and the advantages that gives them. So I think this is a problem that we are horrified by. And we're right to be horrified by, because we have, as Nigel rightly said, we have the resources, we have the will to do something about it. So the question is, why is it not happening? And the answer, like so many of the questions tonight, is it's the Union, it's Westminster. They don't give a damn. There's neoliberal philosophies and neoliberal economics in the City of London, and in Westminster it says, the devil take the hindmost, look after yourself, no such thing as society, those kids will need to shape up or ship out. You know, that abandonment philosophy, and it's not our core beliefs. And I think that's why independence and a vote yes is what those 1 in 8 kids in the borders desperately need on the 18th of September.
Really, just a very quick one-liner on this for the person who asked the question. I think what they need to tell their friends who are concerned about child poverty is that without a yes vote, we do know what is going to happen. We know, not from the Scottish Government, but from international agencies, that if the current policies are carried on with, which the Scottish Government would not do, there are going to be 100,000 extra children forced into poverty by 2020, and those are the opinions of people like Child Poverty and Oxfam.
A few questions to go through, but I think I'm very conscious that time's running on, so I'd just like to make this the last question for this evening. My apologies to anyone that we've not been able to get a question from. Time's run on, the debate's been lively, it's been vibrant, and I really welcome it. So, the last question for the evening, if I may, and it's from Mary Dunsmuir. Why do you think the British government are working hard to keep Scotland on board? Why? Just run down the panel for me and to ask Colin and Nigel.
My top reasons for this is the power of the good example. America and Britain globally are terrified of the power of a good example. They hate the thought that a country could be next door to England and show that there is actually an alternative, that austerity is a political choice. It's be very difficult for them to keep imposing the horror of austerity onto England when they can just look up north and see that there's an alternative. There's a different way of doing things. It's civilised and treats people with dignity and respect and actually creates a growing economy. So that's the first reason. The second one is about, related to that, is clout, international clout. The British establishment are obsessed with things like having a seat on the P5 at the Security Council and projecting clout around the world. It would be embarrassing for them to lose Scotland, for Scotland to come out and say that actually it isn't that great to be part of Britain and to secede. And the other one, I think, is financial. We are contributing. We are the third most productive region of the UK. We're contributing significantly to the coffers at the Treasury, and we're also contributing to the balance of payments as well with our exports, such as whisky. I think we're selling something like 40 bottles a second at the moment, salmon, oil, and so on. You know the rest. So they're the top 3 reasons, I think.
I agree with that, and I'd add that the reason they don't want Scotland to be independent is because Scotland is profitable for them. They lose Scotland, they lose a hell of a amount of money. The second thing is they don't want a yes vote on the 18th of September because they know that a yes vote is a kick in the teeth to neoliberalism. It's a kick in the teeth to the warmongering that is the recent British history. I listened a couple of weeks ago to John Major. Don't people remember him? Apparently he used to be a Prime Minister. Anyway, and he was on chastising other Tory MPs at Westminster who had this rather cavalier, let them vote for independence, we don't need them, wasters, glad to get shot at them. And Major's remark was to say, who's going to fight our wars then? A telling remark.
I'd agree with everything that's been said. And I would emphasise also that not only are we valuable to the United Kingdom state with our oil, gas and all the other things that we've talked about, but also, of course, to lose Scotland will lose a rather significant number of politicians, their careers and their salaries. And that will apply not only to the Scottish members of Westminster, but it will undoubtedly apply to the current leaders of the Conservative and the Labour Party, who will be done for when we vote yes. I'll add one last thought. I think this is a deadly question, incidentally. It's the question which Westminster dare not answer. But I would say that it's a bit like the famous story of the filmmaker Sam Warner, who famously said, "Don't let that bastard in here again unless I need him."
Time's against us. My apologies if we haven't got your question answered tonight. As we alluded to earlier on, following tonight's meeting, we're moving on to IMouth on the 15th of August at IMouth High School. I'm very pleased to say we have Jim Sillers and hopefully some other invited guests as well, so you're more than welcome to come along tonight. I'm conscious of time, Madam, but
I'd just like to know what the other questions were. So
sure, no problem. Yeah, fair point. And again, my apologies. Thank you. Yes, a fair point. I had one on the pound, which is if we continue to use the pound without the monetary union, how would that differ to what we have now? I have an out from James Lockie. I've got a question from Michael Rowe on the EU. Do you believe that Scotland can have real control over its destiny in an increased centralised EU? And then a couple of questions that are really very similar about the future. One from Christine Wood. What do the no vote promise us if we vote no? And the final question I have here is from Jonathan Hunter about the future. Will it make us a better country? So my apologies, there's really no logic to it. I just run through them as I see them really coming, and I try just to get them straight. So if I haven't got to your question tonight, I do apologise. Before I thank my guests, just a couple of minor points. I touched on the 15th of August. Please come along if you can, tell your friends. Plenty of information there about our campaign. Specifically, I'd like to draw your attention to the I Write leaflet, which lists a number of websites that people can maybe access to get more information. But if I could just finish off with a couple of quick points. The best ambassadors for a yes vote are you, the people, not us here on the platform. It's having conversations with your friends, your colleagues, your families about why you may be voting yes or what you're thinking about. So please think about that. And a couple of things I'd like you just to finish and think about when you go away tonight. If you honestly think this is as good as it gets, yeah, the country we live in today, the society we have, then fine, it's a no vote you're looking for. But if you sort of dare to believe that maybe we can do things better, it's not going to be easy. There'll be good days, there'll be bad days. But there'll be our good days and bad days. Vote yes. And finally, I'm a child of the late 70s. My first vote was in 1979, which will probably age me quite nicely. I've been able to sit quite comfortably most of my life and say, well, I didn't vote for that. I didn't vote for that party. I didn't vote for that policy. Nothing to do with me. See, if it's a no vote in September, it's all our faults. Because we voted no. No longer can we turn around and say, well, I didn't want that policy. I didn't want that government. I didn't want the cuts to the NHS or the welfare budget or that war there or that war there. Yes, you did. Because we voted no. Anyway, that's enough from us. Can I just thank my panel once again for tonight? And it's been a great debate and made all the better from your good selves coming along and introducing great lively questions. So once again, on behalf of Yes Berwickshire, thank you for coming. And thank you for Nigel.
I watch the debates on the television all the time. I watch Question Time, I watch the referendum debates, and I've never seen one as good as I saw here tonight.
Marshall's our video man. It should probably be on YouTube within a day or two. Yeah. So thank you very much, but please, it's about you having conversations. Thank you for coming tonight.